December 1944. The cold Italian wind blew across the prisoner camp near Naples. Corporal Franz Weber stood at the fence and stared at the Canadian soldiers playing hockey on a makeshift rink 50 meters away. They were shouting to each other in German, not English, German. Perfect German, with a Bavarian accent exactly like Franz's own village. Franz grabbed his friend Klaus by the arm and whispered, "Are we still in Italy? Did they transfer us to Germany without telling us?" Klaus looked confused. Even Otto, who always had answers for everything, just shook his head slowly. They had been captured by the Canadians 3 weeks ago. Everything they knew told them Canadians spoke English, maybe French, not German. Something was very wrong. Or maybe something was very different from what they had been told their entire lives. The winter of 1944 brought disaster to German forces in Italy. After months of fighting through mountains and mud, the Gothic line finally collapsed. British and Canadian armies pushed through German defences. In early December, approximately 23,000 German soldiers surrendered in northern Italy. Among them were 412 men from the 114th Jäger Division, elite mountain troops from Bavaria and Austria. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were trained for winter warfare, expert skiers, mountain climbers who could fight at altitude. They believed they were the best Germany had. They believed they were fighting for something important. They believed what their officers told them about the enemy. Franz Weber was 22 years old and came from a tiny village called Oberammergau in the Bavarian Alps. His family had lived there for 300 years. They carved wooden religious figures and sold them to tourists. The whole village was famous for a passion play they performed every 10 years. Franz grew up skiing before he could walk properly, climbing mountains with his father, speaking the thick Bavarian dialect that even other Germans sometimes struggled to understand. When he turned 18, the Wehrmacht conscripted him. They put him in the mountain troops because he was born in the mountains. He learned to fight at high altitude, to survive in snow, to move silently through forests. He served in Norway, then Yugoslavia, then Italy. He had been fighting for 4 years and was tired in his bones. Klaus Richter was 26 and came from a farming village near Munich. His family grew hay and raised dairy cows. Before the war, Klaus wanted to study agriculture at university, but there was no money. When conscription came, he joined the mountain troops because they promised better food than regular infantry. Klaus was practical. He didn't believe all the propaganda, but he believed enough to fight. He wrote letters to his parents every week, telling them he was fine, even when he wasn't. His father had died in the Great War. Klaus didn't want his mother to lose her only remaining son. Otto Steinberg was 31 and came from Vienna, Austria. Before annexation in 1938, he had been Austrian, not German, though the Nazis said there was no difference. Otto had been a schoolteacher before the war. He taught geography and history to children. He spoke 3 languages and understood how the world worked. Otto joined the army because refusing meant prison or worse. He kept his doubts quiet. Speaking against the regime could get you shot. For months, these 3 men and 409 others fought in the Italian mountains. They lived in caves and stone houses. They ate whatever they could find. They watched supplies stop coming. They watched the war turn hopeless. Then Canadian troops appeared on the ridgelines. The German commanders told them what to expect if captured. The propaganda was clear and terrifying. The Canadians were colonials, brutal and uncivilized. They would execute prisoners or work them to death. They would torture German soldiers for information. The Commonwealth forces showed no mercy, especially to elite troops. Better to die fighting than surrender. That's what the officers said. But on December 8th, near a town called Imola, their position became impossible. Surrounded on 3 sides, no ammunition left, no food for 5 days, no way to retreat. Their commander, a captain who looked too young to be leading anyone, stood up and raised a white flag made from someone's shirt. 412 men stood together in the cold, waiting to see if the propaganda was true. The Canadian soldiers were professional. They searched for weapons, but didn't harm anyone. They gathered all 412 Germans in a destroyed church. A Canadian officer climbed onto a broken wall and spoke through an interpreter. "You are prisoners of war now. You will be processed and transported to a camp in southern Italy. You will be treated according to Geneva Convention." That was all. Franz felt his stomach sink. Geneva Convention meant they wouldn't be shot immediately. But what came next? Where would they really go? What would happen to them? The propaganda said one thing. This Canadian officer said another. Who was telling the truth? The Germans were loaded into trucks and driven south toward Naples. They sat in the truck's bed, cold and scared, watching Italy pass by. After hours of driving, they arrived at a large camp outside Naples. High fences surrounded it, but no barbed wire. Guard towers stood at corners, but the guards looked bored. This didn't look like the death camp the propaganda promised. They were processed efficiently, names checked against lists, medical inspections for lice and disease, clean uniforms issued, grey-green prisoner clothing with POW marked on the back. The Canadians were organized and calm. Nobody hit them. Nobody threatened them. This confused Franz completely. Where was the torture? Where was the violence they had been promised? That first night, the 412 Germans were locked in wooden barracks. They had bunk beds with real mattresses. They had blankets. They had a wood stove for heat. Some men whispered that this was just the beginning, that the real horror would come later. Franz lay on his bunk and thought about his village in Bavaria. He wondered if his family knew he was captured. He wondered if they were warm enough with winter coming. He wondered if he would ever see the mountains again. Otto sat on his bunk and watched the other prisoners. He was thinking about the German officer who told them the Canadians would kill them. He was thinking about the Canadian soldiers who gave them blankets and food. The propaganda and the reality didn't match, not even close. This thought scared Otto more than anything else. If the propaganda was wrong about this, what else was it wrong about? The Germans spent 2 weeks in the Naples camp. Then came an announcement. They would board ships bound for Canada. 412 prisoners of war would cross the Atlantic to a place none of them had ever seen. A place they knew nothing about except what propaganda told them. And the propaganda said Canada was frozen wasteland full of savages. Franz didn't believe that anymore. Not after the food. Not after the clean barracks. Not after the Canadian medic who treated his frostbitten feet with actual medicine instead of just letting them rot. Something was different. But Franz didn't know how different until the ship docked in Halifax on January 15th, 1945. January 1945. The ship pulled into Halifax harbour at dawn. Franz stood on the deck with Klaus and Otto, watching Canada appear through morning mist. They expected to see primitive buildings, maybe log cabins. What they saw was a modern city. Tall buildings, paved streets, electric lights, cars everywhere. This looked like Berlin before the war. This looked like Munich. This didn't look like wasteland. Canadian guards marched the prisoners off the ship and onto trains. Real passenger trains with seats and windows, not cattle cars. The propaganda said Canada was poor and backward. But these trains were nicer than German trains Franz remembered from before the war. They travelled for 2 days across Canada. Franz pressed his face against the window and watched a country appear that made no sense. Forests that stretched forever. Mountains bigger than the Alps. Cities with factories and warehouses. Farms with huge barns. Everything looked organized. Everything looked wealthy. The propaganda said Germany was the richest, most advanced nation on earth. But looking out that train window, Franz wasn't sure anymore. Canada looked richer. Canada looked more organized. Canada looked like it was winning. The train finally stopped at a small town in Ontario. Kitchener, someone said. The prisoners got off, and guards marched them through streets lined with houses. Normal houses, where normal people lived normal lives. Children walked to school, women shopped at stores, men went to work. Life continued like there wasn't a war at all. Then Franz heard something that made him stop walking. Someone was speaking German. Not English with an accent, pure German. A woman was standing on her porch talking to her neighbor in German. Perfect German, with a Swabian accent from southern Germany. Franz looked at Klaus. Klaus looked back with wide eyes. Otto stopped walking entirely until a guard told him to keep moving. They marched to a camp outside town. Low fences, wooden barracks, guard towers that looked almost decorative. The camp held about 800 prisoners already, Germans who had been captured earlier in the war. The guards separated the new arrivals into barracks. Franz, Klaus, and Otto stayed together. A guard handed them blankets, showed them the mess hall, explained the rules in English that another prisoner translated. That first night at dinner, Franz experienced something that would change everything. The mess hall was a large wooden building with long tables. The 412 new prisoners sat together, nervous and confused. The food was simple, but real. Vegetable soup, bread, butter, coffee. More food than Franz had eaten in weeks, better food than German soldiers got on the front lines. While they ate, a prisoner who had been there longer approached their table. He was German, obviously, with the same grey-green POW uniform. He sat down and spoke to them in German. "You're new? From Italy?" Franz nodded, suspicious. This prisoner looked healthy, not starved, not beaten. He looked like a man who was eating regularly and sleeping in a real bed. "What's it like here?" Klaus asked. The older prisoner smiled slightly. "Strange, confusing. Not what we were told, but you'll see for yourself soon enough. Tomorrow is Sunday. The guards let us go to church in town if we want. That's when you'll understand." "Church in town?" Otto repeated. "They let prisoners go to church?" "With guards, yes. But you'll see. It's not about the church." The next morning, Franz volunteered to go to church. So did Klaus and Otto. They wanted to see this town that let enemy prisoners walk through its streets. About 60 Germans lined up after breakfast. Canadian guards marched them down a road toward Kitchener. But the guards didn't have rifles. They just had clipboards. They walked casually, like they were escorting a school group, not enemy soldiers. The town appeared after a 20-minute walk. Normal streets, normal houses, normal people going about Sunday morning. The guards led them to a large stone church. Zion Evangelical Lutheran Church, the sign said. But underneath, in smaller letters, it said, Deutscher Gottesdienst, German service. Franz stopped walking. German service? In Canada? The guards motioned them inside. The church was beautiful. Old wood pews, stained glass windows, organ music playing. And it was full of people. Canadian civilians. At least 200 people filled the pews. The prisoners filed into seats at the back. Franz sat down between Klaus and Otto. The organ finished playing. A man in robes walked to the front. The pastor. He opened his mouth and began speaking in German. Not English. German. Perfect German with a Hessian accent from central Germany. "Guten Morgen, meine Gemeinde," the pastor said. "Good morning, my congregation." Franz's brain stopped working. A Canadian pastor, speaking German. to a German congregation in Canada during a war where Germany was the enemy. How is this possible? The service continued entirely in German. They sang hymns Franz knew from childhood, Luther's hymns, the same ones sung in his village church. The pastor read from a German Bible. He gave a sermon in German about loving your enemies and turning the other cheek. Franz looked around the church. These weren't prisoners. These were Canadian civilians, German Canadians, free people who chose to speak German, who chose to keep their language and culture, who weren't being punished for being German. After the service ended, something even stranger happened. Canadian civilians approached the prisoners. An old woman with white hair walked up to Franz and spoke in German with a Bavarian accent exactly like his own. "Where are you from, young man?" she asked. Franz stammered, "Oberammergau, in Bavaria." Her face lit up. "Oberammergau, I know this place. My father was from Garmisch, just 20 kilometers away. I grew up there before I came to Canada in 1928. How is the village? Does the Passion Play still happen?" Franz didn't know how to answer. He was a prisoner of war. This woman was the enemy. But she was speaking his dialect and asking about his village like she actually cared. "The play hasn't happened since before the war," Franz said quietly. "Everything stopped when the war started." The woman's face fell. Such a shame, such a beautiful tradition, destroyed by that terrible man and his terrible war. She said "that terrible man" in a way that made it clear she meant Hitler. Franz looked around nervously. Speaking against the Führer could get you killed in Germany. But this woman just said it openly, in public, in a church, and nobody stopped her. Nobody arrested her. Nobody even looked surprised. A middle-aged man approached Klaus. He spoke German with a Prussian accent from northern Germany. "You look hungry, son. Are they feeding you enough at the camp?" Klaus nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. We get 3 meals a day. Good meals." "Good," the man said. "That's proper. Geneva Convention and all that. But if you need anything at all, you tell the guards. This community looks after prisoners. We know you're just soldiers following orders. Not your fault you ended up here." Otto stood frozen as an entire family approached him. Mother, father, 3 children. They all spoke German. The father said, "We sponsor care packages for the camp. What do you need? Books? Writing paper? Warm socks?" Otto's voice cracked. "You sponsor prisoners? Enemy prisoners?" The father looked confused by the question. "You're German. We're German. That you're on that side and we're on this side is just politics. You're still human beings who need help. That's what matters." Franz felt tears on his face. He didn't know he was crying until he tasted salt. This wasn't possible. The propaganda said the enemy hated Germans, but these Canadians were German. They spoke German. They maintained German culture. They helped German prisoners. Everything he had been told was a lie. Klaus was crying too. So was Otto. So were many of the 60 prisoners who came to church that morning. They cried because they realized something terrible and beautiful at the same time. They had been lied to about everything. The enemy wasn't evil. Canada wasn't primitive. German culture wasn't being destroyed by the Allies. In fact, German culture was thriving here more than it was thriving in Germany under Nazi rule. These German Canadians were free. They spoke their language openly. They practiced their religion without fear. They maintained their traditions. They weren't being persecuted. They weren't being forced to forget their heritage. They were just living normal lives as Germans in a free country. The realization hit Franz like a physical blow. His village in Bavaria wasn't free anymore. Not really. They couldn't speak against the government. They couldn't practice their religion fully. They lived in fear of saying the wrong thing. But here, in enemy territory, Germans were free. The walk back to camp was silent. The 60 prisoners didn't speak. They just walked in shock, trying to process what they had experienced. When they got back to camp, other prisoners asked what happened. Franz tried to explain but couldn't find words. Finally, Otto said something that captured it. We asked if we were in the wrong country. The answer is yes. We fought for the wrong country our whole lives. Over the following weeks, Franz and the others learned more. The town of Kitchener had been called Berlin until 1916, when anti-German sentiment during World War I forced them to change it. But the German community survived. About 40% of Kitchener's population was of German descent. They maintained German schools, German newspapers, German cultural clubs. They were Canadian, but proudly German Canadian. They weren't traitors. They weren't ashamed. They were just people who loved their heritage without hating others. The prisoners were allowed to attend church every Sunday. More Canadian civilians approached them, offered them help, spoke to them in German, treated them like human beings instead of enemies. Women from the German-Canadian community organized care packages, books in German, writing paper, warm clothes for winter, musical instruments so prisoners could form bands. One woman brought Franz a carved wooden figure she said reminded her of Oberammergau craftsmanship. She didn't know Franz's family made those figures. When he told her, she cried and hugged him. A prisoner and a civilian, enemy and friend, both crying over a wooden angel. The food in camp was simple but adequate. 3 meals a day, bread, soup, vegetables, sometimes meat, coffee every morning, more than Franz ate as a soldier, much more than civilians in Germany were eating in 1945. Letters from home talked about hunger, cold, bombing. His mother wrote that they were eating turnips and potato peels. Franz ate real potatoes with butter and felt guilty. The work was optional. Prisoners could volunteer for farm labor. Many did because it gave them something to do. Franz worked on a farm owned by a German-Canadian family. The farmer spoke Bavarian dialect exactly like Franz. They talked about mountain farming while planting crops. The farmer paid Franz 50 cents per day, real money. Franz saved it to buy things from the camp store. In March 1945, news came that Germany was collapsing. The Allies were crossing the Rhine. Soviet armies were closing on Berlin. The war was ending in defeat. Some prisoners cried. Others felt relief. Franz felt empty. What was he going home to? A destroyed country? A ruined village? His family had written that several buildings in Oberammergau had been bombed. Nobody he knew had died, but the village was damaged. The Passion Play theatre was gone. 300 years of tradition destroyed. In April, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe ended. Hitler was dead. The Reich was finished. The prisoners waited to see what would happen next. Would they be sent home immediately? Would they be put on trial? Would they be kept forever? The answer came slowly over months. Yes, they would go home eventually, but it would take time. Ships were needed. Organization was required. They would be repatriated in stages starting in late 1945. But then, something unexpected happened. The Canadian government made an announcement. German prisoners who wanted to stay in Canada could apply. Not all would be approved. Criminal background checks would happen. Nazi party members would be rejected. But regular soldiers who just wanted to start over could request permission to immigrate. Franz heard this and didn't know what to think. Stay in Canada? Never go home? Abandon his family? But what family? His father died in 1943. His mother's letters said she was living with his sister now. His sister's husband had died in Russia. His village was damaged. There was no work, no future. Germany was divided between occupation zones. Everything was uncertain. Canada was offering certainty, a chance, a future. Klaus applied immediately. His mother had died during the war. He had no one left in Germany. Canada offered him land to farm if his application was approved. Real land. 160 acres in Alberta. Free land for immigrant farmers. Klaus could have the life he wanted before the war stole it. Otto applied too. His teaching career was over. The Nazis had corrupted everything he taught. He couldn't go back to lying to children. Canada needed teachers for German schools. He could teach again, honestly this time. Franz struggled with the decision for months. He wrote to his mother asking what she thought. Her response came in July 1945. "Stay," she wrote. "Germany is finished. The village is damaged. There's no work, no food, no hope. You have a chance in Canada. Take it. Live for both of us. I'll be fine with your sister. Don't throw away your future for a country that threw away its soul." Franz cried reading that letter. His mother was telling him to abandon her, to stay in enemy territory, to become Canadian. But she was right. There was nothing left in Germany for him. Franz applied in August 1945. Klaus, Otto, and 73 other prisoners from their camp applied too. They waited for months while applications were processed, backgrounds checked, approvals granted or denied. In February 1946, Franz got his answer. Application approved. He could stay. He was crying again. Tears seemed to happen a lot now. Klaus was approved too. So was Otto. 68 of the 76 applicants were approved. 8 were rejected due to Nazi Party membership. Those 8 would be repatriated to Germany. The 68 approved men had a choice now. They could return to Germany voluntarily, or they could start the immigration process. All 68 chose to stay. They would become Canadian citizens. Former prisoners of war becoming citizens of the country they fought against. It seemed impossible, but it was happening. The transition from prisoner to immigrant happened gradually. Starting in March 1946, restrictions eased. The approved men could leave camp during the day, get jobs in town, attend school. They were still technically prisoners until official discharge, but treated more like immigrants awaiting paperwork. Franz got a job at a furniture factory in Kitchener. The owner was German-Canadian, spoke Bavarian dialect, and hired Franz because he knew traditional woodcarving. The work was good, the pay was fair. Franz earned real money and saved most of it. Klaus got his 160 acres in Alberta in June 1946. He left for the West with big dreams. Franz and Otto stayed in Kitchener, where they had community, language, and support. Otto got a teaching position at a German language school in September 1946. He taught geography and history to children of German immigrants. He taught honestly, no propaganda, just facts, just truth. The children learned about World War II from a man who fought in it and learned the hard way that wars based on lies destroy everyone. Franz continued working at the furniture factory. He learned English by attending night classes. He maintained his German by speaking it every day in Kitchener, where half the people were German-speaking. In 1947, Franz became a Canadian citizen. He stood in a courthouse and swore allegiance to King George VI and Canada. He was 25 years old. He had been a German soldier, a prisoner of war, and now he was Canadian. His citizenship papers said, Franz Weber, Canadian citizen, born Germany, Naturalized 1947. He put the papers in a frame on his wall. In 1948, Franz met a woman named Anna at a German cultural festival in Kitchener. She was 23, born in Canada to German immigrant parents. She spoke German and English fluently. She understood what it meant to be both German and Canadian. They married in 1949. They had 4 children between 1950 and 1958. Franz taught his children German. He taught them about Bavaria. He taught them traditional wood carving, but he also taught them about democracy, about freedom, about how propaganda destroys truth. He never lied to his children about the war. He told them what he fought for was wrong, that he had been lied to, that he learned truth from enemies who showed mercy. By 1950, 63 of the original 68 men who stayed had become citizens. 5 returned to Germany after deciding Canada wasn't for them. But 63 stayed and built lives. They married, had children, started businesses, bought houses, became part of Canadian society. Klaus became a successful farmer in Alberta. He married a German-Canadian woman in 1950. They had 6 children. Klaus grew wheat and raised cattle. He became active in farming cooperatives. By 1960, he owned 480 acres and employed 8 workers. He never forgot being hungry. He never forgot the German officer who said Canadians would torture him. He never forgot that everything he was told was a lie. Otto became the principal of Concordia German School in Kitchener by 1955. He taught hundreds of children over 30 years. He helped create curriculum about World War II that told the truth. He made sure German-Canadian children learned about the Holocaust, about Nazi crimes, about why the war happened and what it cost. He never let them forget. He also never let them be ashamed of being German. Culture and politics are different things. You can love your heritage without supporting evil. In 1965, Franz opened his own wood-carving shop in Kitchener. He carved religious figures just like his family did in Oberammergau. His work became famous locally. People came from across Ontario to buy his carvings. He trained his son in the craft. The tradition continued. Franz visited Germany in 1968. He went back to Oberammergau for the first time in 24 years. The village had been rebuilt. The Passion Play Theatre was restored. The play was happening again. His mother had died in 1962, but his sister was still there. She hugged him and cried. She was poor, but alive. The village was beautiful, but sad. So many young men had died. So many families destroyed. The war had cost everything and gained nothing. Franz returned to Canada after 2 weeks. He was glad he saw his village again, but Canada was his home now. Kitchener was where he belonged. In 1983, Franz was 61 years old. Someone organized the reunion of German POWs who stayed in Canada after the war. They wanted to gather as many as possible on the 38th anniversary of Germany's surrender. The event would be held at the Concordia Club in Kitchener, the German cultural center that had helped so many prisoners transition to civilian life. Invitations went out. Responses came back. 47 of the original 63 men who stayed in Kitchener area could attend. Some had died. Some were too sick. Some lived too far away. But 47 came. They brought wives, children, grandchildren. The club filled with people speaking German and English, sharing stories, showing photos, remembering. Franz stood to speak. He was grey-haired now, wearing glasses, looking like a grandfather, which he was 5 times over. In 1945, I asked if I was in the wrong country, he said in German, then repeated in English. The answer was yes. I fought for the wrong country. I believed the wrong things. I followed the wrong leaders. But then I found the right country. Canada showed me what my own country could have been if we had chosen freedom. These German Canadians showed me that you can love your culture without hating others. That being German doesn't mean following dictators. That heritage and humanity are compatible. Klaus spoke next. He was 65, strong from farming, wearing overalls even to the reunion. I came from Germany thinking Canada was primitive, he said. But Canada was advanced in the ways that matter. Freedom, truth, justice. These are more advanced than any technology. I learned that from people I was taught to hate. Otto was 72. He stood straight despite age, still looking like a teacher. We were prisoners of war, but we found freedom in captivity, became as enemies and left as citizens. The Canadians didn't defeat us with guns. They defeated us by proving everything we believed was a lie. They showed us what truth looked like. That was more powerful than any weapon. The reunion lasted all day. The men donated materials to the Waterloo Region Museum and the Canadian War Museum. Franz's diary from prisoner days, letters, photographs. 412 stories preserved. Their story became part of Canadian history. It shaped how Canada treated prisoners in future conflicts. It demonstrated that treating enemies with dignity could turn them into friends. It proved that humanity transcends nationality, even in war's darkest hours. Franz Weber died in 1998 at age 76. His obituary in the Kitchener-Waterloo Record mentioned he was a German immigrant who became a successful woodcarver. It noted his contributions to German-Canadian cultural preservation. It mentioned he had been a prisoner of war who chose to stay. Most people reading the obituary had no idea Franz's story represented something bigger, that his choice and the choice of 62 other men proved that propaganda dies when confronted with human kindness, that enemies can become friends, that freedom means loving your heritage without hating others. Klaus died in 2003 at age 85, a wealthy farmer surrounded by children and grandchildren. Otto died in 2007 at age 96, having taught thousands of children the truth about war. The lessons from their experience remain relevant. War is fought between governments, but lived by people. Propaganda collapses when confronted with reality. The enemy often has more in common with us than our own leaders. Freedom means choosing your identity, not having it forced on you. Sometimes, the greatest act of patriotism is admitting your country was wrong. Sometimes, humanity transcends nationality, even in history's darkest hours. The 412 German mountain troops learned that lesson the hardest way possible. They came as soldiers for a lie. They left as witnesses to truth. And their witness still speaks today, reminding us that truth is stronger than lies, and kindness is stronger than hate.